So first up, we have Dan Clement, who will be talking to us today about water classification of satellite imagery using Python and ArcGIS Pro. So Daniel, when you're ready, please go ahead.
Hi, thank you, everyone. My name's Dan Clement. Today I'm going to be talking to you about my proposed capstone project, which is water classification of satellite imagery using Python and ArcGIS Pro. So just a kind of brief overview of how I kind of reached this project and a little bit of, just overview of the project itself. So the original tool that I wrote for this tool was completed for the Advanced Python for GIS course here at Penn State, and it was my final project for that course. So it essentially consists of some Python scripts that classify the water out of satellite imagery. For my capstone project, I'm going to be taking that tool and creating an ArcGIS notebook walkthrough of a small section of the code to kind of, this will have both an educational and tutorial purpose that will allow readers to run the code and visualize the results. Finally, readers will kind of learn not only how, to perform remote sensing analysis, but to kind of use that with Python coding and within a Jupyter Notebook environment. So first, I just wanted to kind of start out with a few slides of covering some basic kind of remote sensing information that might help you understand my project a little bit more in depth. So in general, there are two main types of remote sensing sensors, first of which would be passive sensors. So passive sensors only receive information coming from the sun. So the sun, emits radiation as light, which travels down, hits the Earth, and then reflects back off of the Earth and is captured by that satellite sensor. So these sensors operate on the principles of the electromagnetic spectrum, and they essentially require the sun's radiation to collect information. So if the sun's not shining, they can't collect, radiation data. So as such, they can only collect imagery in daylight. So the second type of kind of main remote sensing satellite sensor would be active sensors. So these sensors emit their own radiation and record the reflectance. So some examples of these are things like LiDAR, which uses light as lasers, radio waves, which would be radar or SAR, synthetic aperture radar, and some other ones are sound waves such as sonar. You might have heard of many of these kind of sensor types. So active sensors are also based on the principles of the electromagnetic spectrum, and as such, since they emit their own radiation, they don't require the sun's radiation to kind of work. So that allows them to collect imagery at night, or for instance, through clouds, because their radar waves can penetrate through the clouds. So this is just a kind of a cool little graphic I put together that shows the kind of basic workflow of how a satellite collects imagery, and specifically a passive sensor, which I described previously. So as you see on the left here, the sun is kind of emitting, photons of light. That light travels down, hits the, objects on the surface of the Earth, whether that be trees, water, man-made objects, what have you, and that light is then reflected back off of those surfaces into the Earth's atmosphere. And satellite sensors collect that information through their sensors. They collect that reflectance information through their sensor, and then that data is then transmitted to a ground station where it's processed and we kind of get our final result, which you see in the bottom right, which we're all familiar with, just a traditional satellite image. So a little bit more in depth on the actual kind of principles of electro-optical sensors, which are essentially the majority of the Earth observation satellites that we see and use almost daily nowadays. So these sensors, as I alluded to before, use the electromagnetic spectrum, and it's the principle that all remote sensing technologies are based on. As you can see in the kind of graph to your right, there's a very small segment of that spectrum, which is visible light. So that's light that the human eye can see and interpret. This is, as you see, it's a very small segment. However, many satellite sensors can collect data and information outside of that visible band. So what we call bands are small segments of the EM spectrum, and they're measured in wavelengths. So from very short wavelengths to a very long wavelength. These EO sensors are able to see areas of the spectrums that humans can't, and they're primarily referred to as multispectral, or MS, you see it referred to as, but also hyperspectral, which infers that they collect a larger variety of bands than just a traditional multispectral sensor would. So just one kind of important kind of vocab word that I would say is important to understand would be spectral resolution. So spectral resolution is a descriptive term that's used to characterize the number and width of bands that a sensor is able to collect. So in general, the more bands that a sensor collects and the finer the width of those bands, the higher the spectral resolution. And this is not to be confused with spatial resolution, which is obviously the size of the pixel that corresponds to the ground feature that can be seen in that pixel. So that brings us to the question, what can we do with these different bands? One of the most common things we can do is band combinations. So as you see in the illustration on the left, this is kind of a representation of the various bands that a satellite sensor might collect. And as you see, there's 7 different bands that this imaginary sensor collects. In the middle here, you can see what we call as the combination. Generally, some of you may be familiar with, like, for instance, a digital screen that we use, which uses red, green, and blue values, or RGB, you might have heard it called, to kind of construct the image that you're seeing on the screen. So what we can do is that we can choose what band we want to go into each of those red, green, and blue, what's usually referred to as color guns. And these combinations of bands can output different band combos that can display different information about the image being displayed. So as you see on the right, there are kind of some common band combinations. First would be natural color, which many of you are familiar with anytime you open up Google Maps. That's natural color. Basically, it's your red, your green, and your blue bands, and it's what your naked eye would see. Trees, vegetation looks green, water looks bluish, etc. Another very common band combination would be a false color infrared band combination, which utilizes the near infrared band in place of the red band. So as you see kind of in the representation here, the vegetation looks red. One of the other very common things we can do with bands are what we call spectral indices. So spectral indices are essentially mathematical formulas which take advantage of the reflective properties of various materials. So these indices, which number in the hundreds or potentially even thousands, are used to analyze and identify things such as vegetation, water, man-made areas, burned areas, and the list goes on. So what you can see in the top right here is kind of a graph that illustrates the reflectance properties of vegetation in various bands. So those kind of vertical strips, segments are the wavelengths that represent the blue, green, red, and near infrared bands. And on the far right is the near infrared band, and you can see healthy vegetation reflects very highly in near infrared. Unhealthy vegetation reflects much lower, and soil, bare soil reflects even lower than unhealthy vegetation. So it's kind of, spectral indices kind of exploit these sort of relationships between reflectance and different materials that we see on the ground to kind of capture different characteristics of those materials. So one common index is the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, or NDVI, and it's calculated by using the following formula, which is you take the near infrared band, you subtract the red band, you divide it by near infrared band plus the red band, and that gives you your NDVI values, which you can kind of see in the bottom right image here, where darker green is going to represent healthy vegetation, and kind of the red areas represent, yellow and red areas represent unhealthy vegetation, and blue actually represents just bare soil. So that's kind of an agricultural field, and that's one of the common uses of NDVI is to kind of, they call it precision agriculture. So you can kind of measure, the health of your crops from satellite or drone imagery. Pretty useful technique. So this brings us back to my tool. So what problem is my tool solving? So in general, the problem of standing water or identifying standing water is an extremely important task for many geospatial and remote scientists, remote sensing scientists to kind of carry out. It supports not only natural disaster relief and response efforts in, identifying flooded areas, post-disaster, which allows for the allocation of, the better allocation of resources. It allows, disaster management agencies and planners to kind of, know where to send their resources and aid much more rapidly than, for instance, having to send out teams to assess the flooding and report back. It allows for a very rapid assessment of flooding damage and the allocation of resources. One other kind of less intuitive thing that identification of standing water can support is disease eradication efforts. So many insect-borne diseases are transmitted by insects who breed in standing water. Some examples of this are malaria, West Nile virus, and dengue fever. And there are many nonprofit organizations. For instance, I'm aware of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation are actively pursuing remote sensing technologies and utilizing remote sensing technologies to map standing water for some disease eradication efforts in developing countries such as in Africa or the Middle East. So how can we approach and solve the problem of identifying standing water using remote sensing technologies? That's where the tool that I developed comes in. So the tool that I developed classifies satellite imagery to identify and map standing water. The tool is written in Python and utilizes various packages, including ArcPy, as well as some just native Python packages. The tool can be run in both the command line as well as an IDE, but also I built a Arc Toolbox script tool for this Python script, which allows non-code savvy analysts or people to run the tool within ArcGIS Pro without having to write or interpret a single line of code. So the tool in general uses a spectral indices, like I explained previously, and automatic thresholding of those indices to identify water. The outputs are classified water in both raster and vector formats. And currently, the tool works for Maxar's WorldView 2 imagery, WorldView 3 imagery, as well as the European Space Agency Sentinel-2. In the future, I hope to potentially add Landsat to that list of sensors that work with this tool. So this is kind of just a little brief description of kind of the tool formats. As I described before, the tool currently takes the format of some Python scripts. In this case, there's 2 separate Python scripts. One file contains many of the processes and functions that are necessary to kind of perform the classification. And then the second script kind of puts those processes together in the workflow format to kind of carry out the classification of the water. And you can see an example of that kind of on the bottom left there, which is just a screenshot of the one of the Python scripts itself. And on the right, we can see that I've also created a ArcGIS Pro script, the toolbox script tool, which allows the tool to be run within ArcGIS Pro from a graphical user interface. And I think it's really useful to have that integration with ArcGIS Pro, because there are many people who don't necessarily have that coding background to be able to run something like this, and allowing them to run it within just a traditional graphical user interface would be very useful for them. So just a kind of a brief overview of how the tool actually performs the classification. The first step would be to identify those bands that I talked to earlier. So each input image, has various bands, and the tool kind of identifies what those bands are and stores them in, variables. Next, we calculate the spectral indices. So there are a number of various spectral indices that I'm using to actually classify the water. Some include, the normalized difference water index, and a large number of different indices. Next, we're going to perform some automatic thresholding. So oftentimes thresholding can be performed manually, where you have to look at a histogram of the actual indice values and kind of decide manually, like, this is a good threshold. But I found within ArcGIS Pro, there's a very useful tool that they have built in. It's called OTSU thresholding, OTSU. And this is an automatic thresholding. So it automatically uses a statistical method to kind of go in and perform that thresholding without any manual input at all. Finally, the thresholds of those indices are combined into what I call a confidence matrix. So essentially, it looks at each pixel in the input image and each indice of that input pixel, and determines, for instance, if there's 5 different indices and 4 of them agreed that there was water in that pixel, then there's a high likelihood that that's actually water in that pixel. Conversely, if only 1 of the 5 agrees that there was water there, probably a lower confidence that there's actually water in that pixel. So that's kind of the confidence matrix idea. And finally, once we've kind of decided what our high and low kind of confidence of water is, we extract those values, and the tool outputs both a higher confidence layer, so a layer representing higher confidence of water, and a layer representing lower confidence of water in both vector and raster formats. So next, I'm just going to kind of go through a little case study to show exactly how the tool works and what it outputs. So the case study revolves around the Sardoba Dam, which is in Uzbekistan. And in April of 2020, the Sardoba Dam suffered a breach in its containing wall, and the subsequent flood of water inundated a large area of the surrounding land. As you can see in the bottom left there, that's kind of the breach in the actual wall where the reservoir flooded out into the land around the reservoir. And you can see in the reference map here that, it's kind of very near Kazakhstan, but still in Uzbekistan. And areas of Kazakhstan were actually flooded as well from this event. So this is imagery that represents before the dam actually breached. And you can kind of see this large body of water kind of in the lower center of the image is the reservoir created by the dam itself. And this is Sentinel-2 imagery. On the left, you can see just natural color imagery, which I described previously. This is what the naked eye would see. And then on the right, you can see false color infrared imagery, which, as you can see, the utility of a spectral index, a band combination that allows you to see water much more clearly in that image versus the natural color image. This is an image post-breach. So the dam, the reservoir breached kind of on the western side of the reservoir and flooded the area to the north. And you can see there's obviously a large body of water, which was not present in the pre-imagery, a large area of land flooded. And there were actually some towns and villages which were completely submerged by the flooding. It was pretty intense and sad event. This is just a kind of a more of a zoomed in view of the actual breach of the reservoir wall. And you can see how it kind of breached and flowed out. So these are the actual outputs. This is one of the outputs of the classification tool. So I ran, the tool on the pre-breach imagery. And what you can see here in green is a representation of the final kind of output of water existing in the image before the dam breach. This is a representation of the water classified after the dam breach. So what you can see in yellow there is, the flooded area to the north of the actual dam. And then finally, you can see the change. So this is essentially the orange areas represent, the post classification minus the pre-classification, which essentially removes that water that existed before the dam breach. So what you're looking at is only the actual flooded areas. And as you see this, this tool outputs these results in a matter of minutes. So, for a researcher trying to, identify flooded areas, this is a very quick and easy way that they could accomplish this. So finally, I just want to touch on a little bit of the next steps. So what are the next steps for my project? The next steps are going to be to identify the specific section of the Python code that I'll use for the ArcGIS notebook. And then I'll have to build out the notebook. So kind of build my narrative of, these are the kind of lines of code, what the code is doing, and why I'm using that kind of process. And then finally share that, ArcGIS notebook with fellow colleagues and students, as well as submit it for my capstone project. So with that, I'm done, and I will open it up for questions.
All right, Dan, thanks so much for your presentation. That was a great little primer on remote sensing. As we wait for some questions to show up in the chat, I I have a question for you. Aside from the diagnostics that are available through ArcPro, does your application provide any additional diagnostics for the processing or information that the user may be able to make use of?
So do you mean like kind of accuracy assessment type of things, or more diagnostics of the tool actually running, like the processing?
Yeah, either or. What additional output does your tool provide?
So currently it only outputs the actual classification, like the classified areas. I do have it in my kind of roadmap for this tool as kind of just a personal project to include some sort of accuracy assessment of that. Obviously, that would usually require more manual input with ground truth points to output that accuracy assessment. But the tool within ArcGIS Pro or Python, either one, does output various print statements that kind of walk you through what the tool is doing while it's running, and kind of fill you in if there's any errors that come up while running the tool.
Okay. All right. Thanks. Looks like you have a question in the chat window.
Yeah. So this question is from Max, and his question is, what are your plans for disseminating the tool? Is there a particular place you intend to host it? And what kind of documentation will you include? So that's a great question, Max. So currently, I do have a personal kind of GitHub, repository site, and my plan was to, once it's finished, for the actual tool, my plan was to kind of host it on there as an open source, kind of tool that anyone would be able to use. And I certainly would provide a decent kind of documentation for how to get that up and running. And I'm not sure if I went into too great of detail, but the tool only requires ArcPy. So as long as you have ArcGIS Pro installed, you will be able to run this tool. There are no like external packages that you would have to install for Python to get it working. So just ArcGIS Pro is required.
Well, Dan, why don't you put your contact info, your email in the chat, so that if anyone has a follow-up question, they can contact you directly.
Awesome, will do. Thanks everyone for listening.
Thank you. So next up, we have Aaron Green. Aaron, if you want to start sharing your screen, we can check that out. All right, that looks good. Looks good. All right, so next up in our presentation, we have Aaron Green, who is going to talk to us today about utility and pipeline data model, a pilot migration project. So Aaron, whenever you're ready.
Awesome. Can everybody hear me?
You're sounding clear.
Awesome. Good morning, everybody. My name is Aaron Green. I live in California, and I'm currently employed in the energy sector. And for my capstone project, I'll be migrating my organization's existing pipelines, facilities, and equipment data to Esri's utility and pipeline data model, also known as the UPDM. The capstone will serve as a pilot project, only migrating a subset of the overall data to build out a proof of concept for a larger company-wide migration effort. To give you a brief overview, we'll start with a few introductory slides on my personal background, my company, the pipeline infrastructure in general. Then I'll provide some background on how we got to this point and why the project is important to the organization. From there, we'll dig into the major goals and objectives, plan methodology, and the expected timeline and results. And once we get everything wrapped up, we'll have some time available at the end for any questions. A bit of information about myself. I live in Bakersfield, California, which is about 2.5 hours north of Los Angeles. I received my bachelor's degree in geology from California State University, Bakersfield in 2014. That same year, I was hired on with California Resources Corporation, also known as CRC, and I'm currently working as a geoscience specialist. In 2019, CRC accepted my application to their education assistance program, helping me cover nearly all my tuition costs for my master's degree. Without CRC, I would not have had the opportunity to participate in this MGIS program, and it's very important to me to focus my capstone on a work-related topic and bring value to the company through this process. So CRC is an independent oil and natural gas company in the state of California. And throughout its history, CRC has acquired various oil and gas fields, along with a multitude of legacy data sets. For many years, the organization has been siloed, with each team responsible for maintaining its own data sets. And this has led to a lack of standardization across the different assets. However, over the last several years, the company has been under new ownership and a new vision for the future, what we call our One CRC vision, to consolidate and standardize our assets on a statewide level. Additionally, it is the role of data technicians like me to fulfill the company's goals to improve data quality, completeness, and accuracy. So this project is focused on CRC's utilities and pipelines that are used for pumping, transporting, and storing water, steam, and hydrocarbons. And this image shows the entire pipeline supply chain starting at the upstream, where the oil and gas wells are produced and the liquid and gaseous materials enter the gathering pipelines. From there, it moves into the midstream where the materials are separated and processed before being transported to storage facilities or sales points. Once the oil and gas reach the downstream, it is refined and distributed to consumers to power their homes, businesses, vehicles, and more. Our piece of the business focuses on the upstream and the midstream portions of this illustration. This map shows the existing pipelines and facilities data within a small portion of our pilot area. And we can see line features representing the pipelines that are carrying production fluids, injection water, and gas. We can also see point features representing the main facilities and equipment that are associated to the pipeline system. CRC's existing data sets are currently stored within various file geodatabases and feature classes, depending on the geographic location and data type. Furthermore, different assets have varying degree of detail, completeness, and accuracy. And as of now, CRC does not have a standardized data model in place for managing its pipelines and utilities. If we zoom out to a state level view, we can see the entirety of CRC's pipeline layers. On the left here, we can see the state of California. So up in Northern California here, we can see the layers covering the Sacramento Basin. In the mid here, the Southern San Joaquin Valley, and a little bit down south here in the Long Beach area. To the right, we can see a zoomed in view of the area surrounding Bakersfield, showing some of the major assets nearby. And highlighted in green up in the north here is the proposed pilot area, the Kern Front oil field located directly north of Bakersfield. The pilot area covers approximately 19 square miles. And I've chosen this oil field because it is one of the fields I personally manage and I'm familiar with. Also, based on the timeline of the capstone project, I wanted to select a reasonably sized subset of the data. To accelerate the migration from our current state into a standardized utility and pipeline data model, Esri offers the Gas and Pipeline Referencing Utility Network Foundation. This solution contains the UPDM, which is the default ArcGIS data model for liquid and gas pipe systems, as well as pre-configured maps, sample data, workflow tasks, and editing templates. Through the UPDM, data is represented as a single pipe system with connected topology and linear referencing. This provides organizations with the ability to model how the components of the system are connected and prevents them from spending extra time, money, and resources on designing and building their own data model from scratch. And it includes built-in data management workflows, utility, network configurations, and visualization tools that can be customized to the organization's needs. The data model can be deployed in an enterprise geodatabase environment, allowing for multi-user editing and access across the ArcGIS suite of applications. Under this deployment model, data can be accessed through mobile devices, desktop applications, and web services. Pre-configured maps and visualizations give organizations the ability to quickly view their assets spatially and understand how they function together as a network. So this table summarizes the enhanced features of the UPDM over our current data structure. The UPDM provides a standardized data model, a unified utility network, connected topology and linear referencing, advanced network analysis such as tracing and isolation, pre-configured rules to define network behaviors, and pre-configured maps for viewing and editing data. Additionally, the UPDM was designed for optimized functionality with larger data sets within a digital environment. So that takes us to our main objectives. So the main objective of this project is to successfully migrate the existing pipelines, facilities, and equipment data for the Kern Front oil field to an enterprise deployed utility and pipeline data model for CRC. It's important to clean up and standardize the existing data through manual and automated QC and determine validation rules for the UPDM. Additionally, the pilot project will allow us to determine best practices and optimize automation workflows to streamline future QC and migration efforts. The final goal is to configure a few visualization tools to showcase the advanced functionality of the UPDM, such as network analysis, tracing, and generating pipeline schematics. So the first step toward the UPDM migration is the deployment of the ArcGIS solution, which I've completed already. The next step is to generate a data migration map to match existing data columns to their associated fields in the UPDM. To prepare the project environment for UPDM, I'll need to create a new Python project environment and install the utility network package and download the data loading tools provided by ArcGIS. I'll also need to clean up and QC the data through manual and automated processes. From there, I'll configure the data model and tailor it to CRC's needs. I'll start building out the data model within a single user environment, then deploy it to an enterprise environment once complete. And the last steps will be to customize the visualization tools before wrapping up the project and preparing for the capstone presentation. So my goal is to complete the capstone project in the summer and hopefully present my project at the Esri user conference in mid-July. If that doesn't come to fruition, then I may end up presenting my project internally via Zoom. Throughout January and February, I completed my research and began some preliminary work on the capstone project. I acquired all the existing pipelines, facilities, and equipment data from CRC, and I successfully deployed the Esri Gas and Pipeline Referencing Utility Network Foundation to better understand the contents and configurations of the UPDM. Moving forward, I will generate the data transition map for the pilot area. Moving into April, I plan to QC the existing data sets and configure the data validation rules to our organizational needs. 596B will begin in May. At this point, the data migration effort should be commenced for the selected pilot area. The goal is to complete the data migration by mid-June and transition to the project wrap-up stage. If all goes according to plan, I should be attending graduation around August. So by the end of this project, I should be able to smoothly kickstart the larger statewide CRC migration effort. I expect to have clean and standardized data sets across the entire pilot area. Over the next 4 months, I will gain a thorough understanding of the UPDM, editing and automation workflows, and analysis and visualization techniques that the solution offers. And I will generate a set of visualization tools to showcase the added benefits of the UPDM. In summary, my plan is to migrate CRC's existing data sets to Esri's UPDM to create an optimized GIS environment for storing, managing, and visualizing pipeline and utility data within the pilot area. The UPDM offers a wide range of benefits over our current data structure, which I will be able to showcase in my final capstone presentation in July. Thank you for your time. I'll now open it up for any questions.
All right, Aaron, thank you for the great presentation. quite an ambitious project, to say the least. Looks like you have a question in the chat window.
So this question, looks like this question here comes from Steve, I believe. Aaron, does your pilot area of interest contain enough of the necessary infrastructure elements from upstream and midstream functions that will enable you to easily transition the project to the broader company work you must do? So that's a good question. So like I said, the different assets have a varied degree of completeness and deep level of detail. So if I kind of take you back to this slide here, you can see this large field over to the west here is our largest field, Elk Hills, and that contains much more detailed data than the pilot area. But I did pick an area that includes all of the basic information that all of the assets contain, which is those three basic data types, which is pipelines, facilities, and equipment. There are other fields that have more level of details like valves and fittings and rectifiers and things like that, that we'll need to kind of add into the mix when we expand to the larger company. But I do believe this will give kind of kickstart us in the right direction of really understanding the UPDM and its configurations, and how to customize it to our needs when we expand it to that larger data set and those other levels of detail. So hopefully that answers your question. So this question comes from Max, fellow gas GIS analyst here. Does your current network and migrated network include fittings as well as pipes? Are they all distribution lines or also service lines? Not sure if your company delivers to residential commercial clients. So yeah, it's mainly the gathering and distribution lines are our focus. And like I said, with other data, with other fields, they do have additional data sets like that, like valves and rectifiers and fittings and Ts that can be included in the data model. For the pilot area, again, we're just focusing on the basic pipelines, facilities, and equipment to get us started. Can you talk about, this question comes from James. Can you talk about some of the data conversion challenges you expect to run into to transition to the Esri data model? That's a good question. I guess since I haven't really started that migration project yet, I'm not entirely sure what hiccups I might have along the way. All of the data is currently stored in file geodatabases and feature classes. So they're all at least in the same format. So I think, migrating it from an ArcGIS table or feature class into another ArcGIS table feature class, I'm hoping that will be a smooth transition.
Aaron, I have a quick question for you. You can respond to the other chat question because it's a follow-up to.
Oh, yes. And this comes from Jim. Does the company already have the hardware and software needed to move to an enterprise geodatabase, or do you need to convince them to get it? So CRC already has all the ArcGIS suite of applications. And so we've already got, the company has already selected the UPDM as our data model that we want to migrate to. We just haven't had the time and the resources available up to this point to actually move this project forward. And so no convincing is needed for this. Everybody's already on board to get this project going.
All right, I just have a real quick question. So the quality control assurance check that's you talked about, who are you setting that up? Is that CRC? Is that an industry standard, or is this controlled by Esri?
Yeah, I'll be configuring all of it within the data model, but there will be a level of discussing this with the team to ensure that It goes along with the organizational needs and validation rules that we would like within our organization. So that's going to take a team effort of between a handful of us within the organization to determine that.
All right, thanks for that. If you want to put your email contact in the chat window, and if anyone has follow-up questions, they can get a hold of you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you for your presentation. All right, so next up we have Max Adida. Max, if you want to start sharing your screen, we'll
absolutely
see if we can get that rolling.
All right, you're able to see that.
We are, yes. That's good.
Okay. Great.
So Max will talk to us today about mapping the missing middle, housing affordability and development in San Jose, California. So Max, whenever you're ready.
Hello everyone, my name is Max Adida. Before I begin, I'd like to thank you all for attending this presentation. I'd also like to thank my advisor, Emily Rosenman, for helping me turn my initial ideas into this research proposal. Today, I will be presenting on my research project on housing affordability and development in San Jose, California. This presentation will walk through the problem of housing affordability, the impact of exclusionary zoning and its legacy of racial discrimination, the specifics of my case study in San Jose, California, my research questions, the data sources I'll be utilizing in my analysis, my methodological approach to this topic, as well as my anticipated results, potential challenges and limitations, and finally, my project timeline. I'm sure many, if not most of you, are aware of the issues surrounding housing affordability in the United States, and until recent events, it was a near daily headline, with many framing the issue as a crisis. Rather than hyperbole, these headlines are borne out in data from the US Census Bureau and from the Department of Housing and Urban Development on the median sale price of homes in the United States since the 1960s, and have captured a sharp rise in housing prices, which, while rising steadily over the past 10 years or so, have absolutely skyrocketed since the start of the pandemic. There's still debate over the exact reasoning behind why housing costs have increased so much during a once-in-a-century pandemic. Theories include favorable borrowing environment and the influence of investors on housing stock. However, a consensus is beginning to emerge concerning a lack of housing stock as one of the root causes of issues around housing affordability. According to the same sources of this previous chart, as of January, there is a 6.1 month supply of housing in the United States, meaning that if no more housing was constructed, the US would run out of housing stock in a little over 6 months. And the solution to this issue seems pretty obvious, right? It's like to build more houses. And we are building more houses, but as this graph of new privately owned housing unit construction shows, new housing construction was still recovering from the 2008 recession and plummeted during the initial months of the pandemic. Currently in the US, housing unit construction is back at the same trend prior to the pandemic, but this is still well below the historic averages. In particular, current home construction rates are below average for periods when various generations were aging into the housing market, as is the case for many millennials, who are the largest living generation and whose purchasing power was stunted by the Great Recession. However, it doesn't just matter that homes are being built, it also matters where homes are being built, what types of housing is being built, whether it is single family housing, attached homes, mixed use multifamily units, or high rises, as well as the nature of those units. Are they rentals or privately owned? Are they market rate or affordable? How affordable are they? Are they rent controlled? What are the requirements of these new homes? This spectrum of housing types is encapsulated in the concept of the missing middle. The missing middle describes a range of multifamily and clustered housing that provides rental and purchasing opportunities at a variety of different price points. Rather than emphasizing maximum density, the missing middle seeks to build multifamily housing at a scale that is in line with single family and transitional neighborhoods and supports walkability. So also importantly, the concept of the missing middle doesn't call for the abolishment of single family detached homes, rather that this type of housing coexists within the spectrum of housing types. Examples of the missing middle housing, which were common in pre-World War II America, include side-by-sides and stacked duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes, bungalow courts, accessory units, as well as town and row houses. These types of housing fit between high-density apartment buildings and low-density single-family homes and may act as a transition between mixed-use and commercial zones and single-family residential. And the missing middle isn't missing by accident. Rather, it's the result of numerous path dependencies for cities since the early part of the 1900s. To touch briefly on the topic of redlining during the New Deal era, as I'm sure many of you know, the term redlining derived from maps produced by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, known as HOLC, which classified mortgage risk based on a number of factors, but primarily the presence of Black and immigrant residents of various neighborhoods as an indicator of greater mortgage risk. The Federal Housing Administration engaged in a very similar process and actually exercised far more anti-Black discrimination in their practices than HOLC. However, all but one of their maps was destroyed when the FHA was being sued for discrimination in 1969, following the passage of the Fair Housing Act in 1968. And this is that map. It is of Chicago. These lending practices existed alongside other mechanisms which prevented racial minorities from buying into housing, the housing market. Specifically, once racial zoning ordinances were struck down by the Supreme Court as part of Buchanan versus Worley in 1917, cities began instilling into law various zoning ordinances which protected detached single-family homes. And when the Buchanan ruling was issued, only 8 American cities had exclusionary zoning ordinances. However, by 1937, 1,246 cities had adopted these ordinances. And these ordinances entrenched de facto discrimination by regulating the types of homes which could be built, effectively banning affordable housing, increasing the cost to developers, and ensuring that only large luxury homes were profitable and pricing already economically depressed minorities out of home ownership. That brings us today, where the majority of American cities engage in exclusionary zoning, which heavily favors detached single-family housing. It makes other types of housing illegal in areas zoned exclusively for single-family residential. Beyond the illegality of other forms of housing, various zoning laws also impact affordability. Most cities maintain minimum lot sizes, which prevent increased density by mandating that lots in various zones must be of a certain size. Cities also establish minimum setbacks, which again prevent more dense housing by requiring that buildings be built a certain distance from property line. These are frequently combined with minimum square footage, which means that it is illegal to build smaller, more affordable starting homes, even if they meet other criteria. A related concept is floor area ratios, which limit the size of building area in relation to the size of the building's parcel. And this ensures that buildings fit within a specific margin of size. Most cities also maintain minimum parking requirements, typically on a per unit basis. This means that even in the case of apartments, developers must set aside significant space for parking and thus build a smaller number of more expensive units or add to the cost of projects by building underground parking garages. Parking requirements are also thought to provide preferential treatment to cars and disincentivize other forms of transit. Lastly, most zoning requirements also maintain height restrictions, which limit how tall buildings can be, and thus even when high density is allowed, it must be contained in shorter buildings, leading to either less or smaller units being built. Combined with exclusionary zoning, these regulations make it far more difficult to develop additional housing stock that exists at a wide variety of price points and living arrangements. As such, these requirements contribute to higher housing and rent prices. Turning towards my project specifically, I'm looking at the city of San Jose, California. Located on the southern shore of San Francisco Bay, San Jose is the 3rd most populous city in California and has a strong association with Silicon Valley, with companies including Cisco Systems, Adobe, PayPal, HP, and Zoom maintaining their headquarters in the city. The median home price in the city is $1.3 million, while the median household income is a little over $100,000. While the National Low Income Housing Coalition found that San Jose has the second highest rent in the country, with the median rent of a 2-bedroom unit of approximately $3,051 a month. Despite these statistics, approximately 9% of the population live in poverty. That's about 91,000 people. San Jose is also known for having amongst the highest proportion of single-family zoning in the country, peaking several years ago at 94% of the city zoned exclusively for single-family residential. According to a 2021 study by UC Berkeley's Othering and Belonging Institute, San Jose was the city with the 3rd highest levels of internal segregation out of the 101 municipalities in the Bay Area. This means that while San Jose is a high diversity city, with Asians and Latino residents making up the majority, approximately 69% of the population, the city itself is heavily segregated between white residents, who make up only 23.6% of the population, and the rest of the population who are minorities. This racial segregation is consistent with historical discriminatory practices, with larger minority communities existing in areas that were discriminated against via lending practices, as well as in terms of infrastructure, where infrastructure was placed, with the majority minority communities existing on the eastern side of the highway, which bisects the city. Additionally, majority minority census tracts also exhibit higher rates of rental units, and this is true for minority communities that are zoned exclusively for single-family residential. Within this context, I've developed several research questions that this project will seek to investigate, and I'll talk a little bit more about the policies that are specifically at play in the next slide. First, I want to know what areas of the city saw the most residential development from 2018 to 2022. The goal is to understand which projects were permitted and completed in that time frame and where they were located. Although most of the city is zoned for single-family residential, the city on a semi-frequent basis also makes exceptions to the zoning ordinances, meaning that multifamily housing isn't necessarily confined only to areas where the number of units being built are allowed. By understanding what parts of the city saw the most development during this period, I hope to gain an understanding of the overall spatial trend in development. As part of this question, I'm also interested in understanding how the distribution of housing types deviate from the general development pattern. Specifically, I am interested in understanding if certain types of housing, meaning single family, ADU, duplex, or apartments, are being concentrated in one specific area. Also, I'm interested in knowing where affordable versus market rate housing is being developed. I also want to investigate how the distribution of different housing types interact with historic patterns of segregation, as inferred by areas designated in the 1939 Hulk map, as well as contemporary and racial segregation in the city. A related question is where are ADUs being built, since they are restricted to single family zoned areas. Within this question, I am interested in what the assessed value of the house building the ADU is to understand if ADUs are being added to a specific range of neighborhoods in terms of home value. I'm also interested if there is a range of incomes which are more interested or capable of pursuing ADUs. Lastly, and I'll explain more what these bills mean, while SB 9 and SB 10 have only taken effect in recent months, I'm interested to see if there is a noticeable difference in the type of plans that are being approved for development. Unlike the other two questions, for this one, I'm considering projects that have been permitted but not completed. So these questions are informed by the various recent efforts taken to address housing affordability. In 2018, the city adopted what was originally a 15-point housing crisis plan, but which has subsequently bloated into a 41-point plan as of 2021. Of these points, I'll summarize some of the proposals, which I think are most relevant to the current research. The cornerstone of this plan was the city's commitment to encourage the development of 25,000 new units by 2023, of which 15,000 were to be market rate units, while 10,000 were to be affordable units. Now, to qualify for an affordable housing, As of 2021 in San Jose, an individual must make 50% or less of the area median income. And for one person, this is $58,000 a year or $74,600 a year for a family of three. The city has fallen well short of this goal. As of August of last year, the city had only added 3,348 housing units, of which 506 were affordable. Beyond commitments to additional housing construction, San Jose has explored applying rent restrictions, loan programs to incentivize the construction of accessory dwelling units, a housing type I'll elaborate on shortly. They've also established an affordable housing fund to subsidize the construction of affordable units. Beyond these steps, the city has dropped or changed zoning fees that would typically be applied on a per square foot basis. And lastly, the city has sought to increase zone densities near transit. The next substantial reform was a statewide law mandating that cities allow the construction of accessory dwelling units. Accessory dwelling units are a common form of residential infill and may be detached from the main structure or segmented from existing space in the main structure. Historic examples would be converted carriage houses or basement apartments. The state law has been rewritten and updated several times to close loopholes being used to restrict the construction of these units. ADUs in California must be permitted ministerially and allowed jurisdiction-wide. ADUs don't count towards the city's general plans or zoning densities. There is no minimum lot size for the addition of an ADU. ADUs may be up to 50% of the square footage of the primary dwelling. There is a maximum parking requirement of one space per ADU, which is waived depending on proximity to public transit. Jurisdictions are allowed to establish height restrictions, and there is a minimum rental term of 30 days to prevent the use of ADUs as short-term rentals like Airbnbs. The most recent statewide policies that impact this research are SB 9 and SB 10, and these bills attracted significant national attention and were passed in 2021, and they took effect January 1st of this year. SB 9 allows for the division of single-family homes into 2 units to be sold separately without dividing the parcel, essentially creating duplexes. This division stacks with ADUs, effectively allowing up to 4 units per parcel. This bill also allows parcels zoned exclusively for single-family residential to be divided in half, and each parcel may have a duplex as described above and 1 ADU. So that would bring it up to, I think, 6 per what was previously a single parcel. Both these types of development are subject to various renter protections, which limit the status of many single family homes. SB 10 allows for single family zoned parcels in certain areas to be upzoned to up to 10 units per parcel. Lastly, for both bills, the development must conform to various rules concerning the California Environmental Quality Act, which was, this act was recently in the news as the basis for the city of San Jose, city near San Jose, Woodside, California, declaring the entire city a mountain lion habitat to prevent the construction of duplexes. And for the California Supreme Court ruling, which just a few weeks ago forced UC Berkeley to rescind at least 5,100 admissions offers when a resident of Berkeley successfully sued to prevent the university from building additional student housing. In terms of data sets, I'm relying upon federal and local data sets, as well as combining spatial and non-spatial data sets. Federal data sets include US Census Bureau data from the American Community Survey. Specifically, this data set includes information on the number and type of housing units in different tracts, as well as income, and along with census data, the demographic makeup of tracts. Data sets from the city include the San Jose Housing Site Explorer, which allows users to apply a variety of filters to data on residential units. This web portal was created to facilitate developers finding properties to build upon. For this data set, it has no API. I'll have to query it manually and export CSV files. I'll also use the city's building permit web app, which I will query using an API to generate a list of properties where developers have applied for permits to construct housing units. I'll also use parcel zoning and address data to create maps and as a basis for other forms of analysis. I'll also include transit data as a means of understanding where SB 10 is applicable. Lastly, I'll supplement these data sets by joining or relating a table that consists of housing unit information that is included in permit applications and not in either data portal. In terms of preliminary methodological approaches, I believe I'll primarily be conducting point pattern analysis of all new housing units of different housing types and classes, as well as the location of ADUs. I'd like to conduct temporal comparisons of point pattern analysis to see how development has changed since 2018 and tie that analysis to different changes in legislation and ordinances. I'm planning on conducting regression analysis by housing type and ACS tract to understand the relationship between development and racial diversity of tracts. I'd also like to apply regression analysis to ADUs and economic factors. As for anticipated results, I haven't generated explicit hypotheses and null hypotheses here, but I intend to create heat maps indicating areas of increased residential development. Regression analysis will test whether a relationship exists between the city's demography and where different types of and classes of housing are being developed. The presence or absence of which may help inform how more equitable housing distribution may be achieved. Regression analysis applied to ADUs will seek to understand how ADUs fit within economic trends in the city and the types of homeowners who are using ADUs as supplemental income. Lastly, a distribution of newly approved projects may provide insights into if developers have changed their trend in development since SB 9 and SB 10 have passed and gone into effect, and if there are potentially areas of the city which are more conducive to this type of redevelopment. When designing this project, I encountered a few issues which may adversely affect my ability to achieve the project as I just outlined. The most difficult aspect of this project is compiling data and data accessibility because I can't use an API to query at least one of the data sets. Gathering data and ensure that the data is complete may pose a challenge. Second, the time period I'm interested in for which I have data coincides with the COVID pandemic, when for most of 2020 activities ground to a halt. So it will certainly throw off 2020's data and influence 2021 and 2022, although I'm not sure if these latter years will be characterized by stagnation or increased activity to get caught up from the stoppages during 2020. Lastly, evidence from Minneapolis, Minnesota and Portland, Oregon show that after single family zoning is eliminated, there's a lag of 3 to 4 years before developers begin to redevelop previously single family parcels. And this is due to a variety of reasons, including needing to find properties for sale and the development of specific plans for these new housing types, because most firms do not have experience building missing middle types of housing. This research has showed that upzoning single family residential parcels also increases the price of those properties by 5 to 7%, but in the long term is thought to reduce housing prices overall. This means that land can become more valuable than the house on the property, and that may influence where development of these properties occur. Finally, I intend to finish and present this project and graduate in the fall of 2020. I will spend the spring and summer conducting background research, compiling data sets, and conducting analysis on previous year's data sets. In August, I will begin conducting analysis of this year's data set. After finishing this project in the fall, I intend to refine the research and then produce a manuscript for publication. These publications are some of the ones I drew upon completing this proposal, while the other list is attributions of images I used in this presentation. I'll also plug the UCLA Housing Voice podcast, which is a super accessible way to learn about this topic for those that are interested. And I'd be happy to answer any questions or address any comments. Also, please feel free to email me about this project. My email's here, but I'll also post in the chat. Thank you.
All right, Max, thanks for a topic that is both very sensitive and obviously very, very important for equal housing opportunities. Looks like you have a question in the chat window.
Yes. Okay. Okay. So housing material costs have spiked significantly over the past 2 to 3 years. Will that be part of your analysis in determining the cause of effect beyond the policy?
No.
And this is by Stephen McKeague. Yeah, so that is a huge issue, which is not going to be accounted for in this research specifically. And the reason for that is I don't know necessarily how to account for it. And I know that specifically timber prices, for example, were grossly like overinflated recently. Yeah, so I think that that's an interesting part of it. And I know there's been research on that. It's just not specifically part of this policy. And does anybody else have any questions?
While there, if anyone else has a question for Max, go ahead and
Jim
enter in the
has,
chat.
sorry if I missed it, but is there previous work on this topic that you could learn from and build upon? Yeah, so there's been a lot of recent literature on the elimination of single-family zoning. Specifically, I think it kind of became a almost like a zeitgeist in urban planning after the book on redlining came out. I think it's called The Color of Law. But there is a lot of literature on different approaches to zoning and how that impacts housing affordability. There's also research on different approaches states have taken in addressing housing affordability. So California is best known for taking these statewide approaches to zoning. Where in the Northeast, cities like or states like Massachusetts have adopted policies where basically if cities are not meeting their housing affordability needs as outlined by the state, basically the state comes in and says, well, you can no longer discriminate against that kind of development, and we're going to override your zoning laws for those purposes. So there's literature on that. There's various literature also on walkability and this missing middle and how residential infill also impacts other types of transit. This is really big in Los Angeles, where there's recently been proposed I believe it's a new subway line that goes under Bel Air, and people are very upset about that. So there's a wide variety of research that I'm drawing upon for this.
Max, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
This may be outside of the scope of your project, but it kind of occurs to me that the policies that are put in place are there because of a certain group of individuals. I don't know whether it's the planning department or zoning department. I don't know what they call that in San Jose, but have you thought at all about looking at the composition of those individuals and how that has changed over time in relation to the kinds of questions that you're asking?
That is a really interesting factor that I hadn't considered. Right. I would be interested to know how I would acquire that data, right? Because they're city employees. But I think that'd be a very interesting question, and look at different benchmarks, like temporal benchmarks for when different policies were enacted or suggested. I would also think then that I would look at like city councilors, like the diversity of city councilors as well, and see if that has changed over time and how that also matches up to those benchmarks. But I think that that'd certainly be a really interesting way to place to take this research.
Yeah, I don't know if how members of those committees or organizations are put in there, if they're elected, if they're appointed, if they're just part of their job.
Yeah, I think
so yeah,
that
finding out their political leanings may be problematic.
Yeah, at least for city, like the planning department, the people doing the analysis and making recommendations, I think that they're just hired by the city. But the housing crisis plan was developed by the city councilors, which is why it's like become like 41 points from an initial 15 points. And there's wacky stuff in there like more off-street parking, which kind of is the antithesis of we need more housing. So yeah, I think that that'd be really interesting to see how the plan has at least changed.
Like I said, I don't know how exactly you would integrate that, but I just thought that'd be worth mentioning.
Thank you. It's a great suggestion. I'll write it down. All right. You mentioned, so this is coming from Fred. You mentioned Portland and Milwaukee provide evidence of zoning changes. How do their policy impacts recommended? How do their policies impact recommendations for San Jose? Timeline of zoning changes, i.e., was there a rapid change from single-family housing to apartments, or a slow, gradual change in demographic impacts? So there are I would have to go check what years it happened. I believe, and it was Minneapolis. If I said Milwaukee, I apologize for that. Minneapolis, Minnesota eliminated single family zoning, I believe, in 2018 or 2019. In Portland, there was around the same time. So there hasn't really been enough time to see substantial redevelopment of single family parcels. And one thing that the California legislation does, which is it's a statewide policy, they have renter controls and renter protections, which basically, if a house had been rented to somebody within the past 15 years, it's ineligible for, even if it's come off the rental market, there's like basically a limit to how much you could redevelop that property. Same with if it's been rented within the past 3 years, you can only like demolish and redevelop up to 50% of the property. So there's these different benchmarks that properties have to meet to know how they or to ensure how they're redeveloped equitably. But that then means that you're looking for long-term homeowners who want to sell their single family house that in San Jose is worth over $1 million to a developer. And a lot of people, right, don't necessarily want to sell their home to a developer. There's also an increased prevalence of the concept of aging in place, where a lot of people want to stay in their home. So it's still a matter of debate how much these previous changes have impacted what we're going to be seeing in San Jose and what the state of California is doing. But initially, we see that there is some redevelopment in Minneapolis, and that like I said, the parcel prices have increased, but there has been some development of duplexes and I think triplexes, as well as in terms of demographic impacts. I'm not really sure what the demographic impacts have been so far. I'll also say that Minneapolis also in November of last year passed rent control on new construction. And as a result, we see a sharp decline in permitting of new multifamily rental units. So there's some debate about rent control and rent control policies and whether the building should age into rent control or should be subjected to rent control from the beginning. I'm not sure if I answered all those questions. Another interesting but hard to get set of data would be telephone records inquiring about proposed development plans on the different types of projects, as many calls would occur more than applications. I think that's true. I don't know. Yeah, I don't think I'd be able to get that. I think that what I have access to all the permitting. So San Jose produces a PDF every week of all permitting applications for that week. So that's kind of like where I'm getting information on how much affordable housing versus market rate there is. So that's kind of my biggest data set. I've also considered looking at city council meetings where people will go and discuss zoning projects, but that is also kind of outside of the scope of this project. So is there any more questions?
All right, Max, thanks again for your great presentation.
Thank you. And I'll throw my email in the chat as well.
All right, that'd be great. Next up, Cheryl Duarte.
Yes, hello.
If you want to go ahead and start sharing your screen, that'd be great.
Sure.
All right, looks good.
Okay. Hello and welcome to my presentation. My name is Cheryl Duarte and I'm a park ranger and in San Diego, California. I got my undergraduate in coastal and marine biology from the University of North Florida, where I first started my research into invasives. Today, we'll go over some of the background, including why invasive control is needed, who this project is for, the data and software I plan on using, my methods and expected results, as well as my resources. Here's a photo I took at my last park, Hanna Park in Jacksonville, Florida. Wild taro was introduced to the area as an ornamental garden plant and quickly spread just absolutely everywhere. And what it does is that it shades out native plants that grow at the water's edge and increase erosion. So the root is edible if it's cooked, but the plant itself contains compounds that cause physical damage to the skin and the mouth, making it very difficult to remove and making it a plant that like grazers and herbivores in the area aren't going to be eating. So while many non-native plants have been introduced since globalization over the past 200 to 2,000 years, not all species are classified as invasive. So in the very simplest terms, a species, plant or otherwise, is considered invasive when it harms the new environment. For plants, this often means becoming the dominant or only species. Kudzu, as seen here, is a classic example many are familiar with. So unlike taro, all of kudzu is edible, and some areas in the south are like bringing in goats to eat the kudzu, and that is helpful. But as you can see from this picture, it's an incredibly aggressive vine. It completely takes over everything. It not only outshades any competitors, it also just takes up all the nutrients. You see here, it looks like it's, you know, a shrub or something or a tree, but it's really a vine that's just grown over all these trees and just killed everything else that was there. So this really decreases biodiversity and leaves the ecosystem less resilient against changes like major changes in climate. And this has implications for all the species that make use of that environment. Some species will be able to relocate, like maybe some insects, a lot of mammals, but many will not, like plants. You know, they're pretty notorious for not being able to, get away from situations they don't want to be in. So they have to stick it out and they often get outcompeted. And that leads to the loss of those species. And in some cases, if it's endemic to that area, that's the extinction of the entire species. There's no coming back from that kind of situation. And plants get introduced into an area in several ways. We bring in plants from agriculture and they can escape cultivation and start creeping into the landscape. A lot of the invasive plants that we have to deal with as rangers, people bring in as ornamentals in landscaping or gardening, and they get just completely out of control. And then plants other plants and animal invasives can also be brought in unintentionally through shipping, through the ballast of ships, or through, snakes have gone into islands by sneaking up into airplane, wheels and just, hopping a ride over to a new, completely unprepared environment. So it currently falls to park employees and community volunteers to do the bulk of invasive removal, with the exception of companies who pay for remediation services to offset the destruction and loss of habitat caused by new construction plans. I will focus on parks and community spaces. As both a park ranger and a biologist, I am often conflicted about the best course of action. As a park ranger, a big part of our job is to preserve the historical integrity of our park, both culturally and ecologically. This means fighting to remove any and all invasives that threaten the park that you love. This can lead to trying to take on too many removal projects at once, stretching already thin resources and making all of the projects suffer. At Hanna Park, there was seldom time to do any removal at all due to limited staff. And when you did have time, you then had to choose which species to focus on that day. Do I have time to get dressed out to get into the lake to deal with taro? Or do I only have a little bit of time, and so I'm going to go dig up some kalanchoe. There just wasn't time to make a really focused plan and stick to that when each ranger kind of had their own idea of what was important. You can see here a purple loosestrife poster used by the U.S. Forest Service and the strong language used to talk about this invasive. It really gets across how much rangers hate invasives. On the other hand, as a biologist who has studied invasives for the past 5 years, I'm much more flexible. Some species are more detrimental than others, and quite frankly, many are here to stay. This means carefully studying the species involved to see which are causing the greatest impact. Bush honeysuckle is another invasive, but was found by Penn State biologists Carlo and Gleditch to increase the diversity and number of birds, which then increase the spread of all fruit-bearing shrubs, not just honeysuckle. So even though honeysuckle was still dominant in the environment, there were benefits to the bird populations and some benefits to their rival native shrubs. So you can see that invasives are complicated. But wait. I'm a park ranger and a biologist, but I'm also a pragmatist and a pessimist. As much as I hope things will change, we need to take climate predictions into account. With climate change, some invasives will no longer tolerate their invaded environment and others will thrive even more. In order to make best use of our resources, we should consider which species will be causing the greatest impact under the new predicted climate and target them for removal now. To put it simply, I don't want to waste my time removing plants that climate change is going to kill off for me. Many species already live at the top end of their temperature tolerance ranges. Especially in more equatorial areas, the increased temperatures could kill off many of the species that are found there, including the invasives. In my previous study of invasives from a biological perspective, research took one main form: raise plants like this orchard grass in individual containers in a greenhouse and see how they react to the change in a single environmental parameter. I was mostly interested in increased atmospheric carbon dioxide, which favored both natives and invasives, and increased temperature, which did favor invasives. These studies are great for finding the tolerance levels of species, but less practical for informing removal. The GIS-centered studies focused on mapping the current extent of invasives using remote sensing and expensive drone and LiDAR systems to map plants. This is vital information for tracking the spread of invasives, but it is prohibitively expensive and beyond the capabilities of most small organizations. Combining the basics of these two methods, tolerance ranges and location data, gives us a good basis to predict the future ranges of invasives. My goal is to use freely available data and low to no cost processes to determine which species will be most affected by climate change. My target area will be the Tijuana River National Estuary Research Reserve, or NER. The NER is 9.45 square kilometers and is Southern California's largest wetland. Wetlands, coastal regions, and islands are most vulnerable to being overrun with invasives because they have higher levels of endemic species, which can only be found there. The park contains dune, salt pan, salt marsh, mudflat, brackish pond, riparian, and coastal sage scrub habitats, and a couple more as well, meaning that the invasives that are found there will be representative of many different habitats. I'm also located in San Diego, so I'll be able to collect data if I need it. They have a dedicated weather monitoring station there and have been doing active research for many years, so I'll have a lot of data to draw on. And they also have some GIS data freely available, like this beautiful boundary shapefile that I found. And this makes the NER a great local candidate for my project. For my data, I will use the information provided by the NER weather station and surrounding stations for my climate change or current climate zones, and use climate models to create zones predicted by like low, moderate, and high change scenarios. I'll focus on temperature and precipitation changes to determine these zones. I will also make a database of invasives found at the NER with their tolerances found through sites like the California Invasive Plant Council and the San Diego Plant Atlas. I'm particularly interested in the location data provided through the iNaturalist app, which is an app you can get for both Android and Apple, and you basically can go around, and wherever you are, if you see an interesting whatever plant, animal, anything, you snap a picture of it and you can sort of walk through trying to identify it yourself. It then gets sent to professionals in that field to verify. And once it's been verified, that location data is publicly available. So you can get a huge data set, it's worldwide, and it's very accurate. I will then process or combine the location data with the zones to determine if a species has already invaded and use that as my starting point. This will be compared to the predicted zones, and I will calculate the new areas for each species and determine if climate change will have a statistically significant impact on the invasives, and if so, which is most significant and should be quickly targeted for removal. I'll look not only at the areas of pre and post climate change for the different levels, but also compare the species, to each other to see if one of them really stands out as having a bigger impact. So most plant zone maps are concerned with low temperatures in the area, which would kill off tender plants or prevent seeds from germinating. I will create plant zones based on the high temperature and for the current situation, and then also zones for the low, moderate, and high predicted high temperatures. This is because previous studies, as I mentioned, showed that high temperatures favored invasives, and I will look to see if there is a limit to that favoritism. I will also be creating a database from the data mentioned, and also filling in any gaps by referencing scientific literature that is available. I will also include additional information such as photosynthesis pathway. This is suspected to have some impact on whether or not plants are successful invasives. And so basically there are 3 different types of photosynthesis pathway, and they sort of just determine where in the plant cell photosynthesis occurs. And this is believed to have developed as a protection against using oxygen instead of carbon dioxide in the pathway, which is basically useless and wastes a bunch of the plant's energy. So over time, they've kind of moved that as atmospheric carbon dioxide has decreased, they've moved that pathway deeper into the cell in order to protect it from these sort of accidents. And I'll also include if the plant has a taproot. These were also determined to help invasives when they were different from whatever the natives had going on. So if natives didn't have a taproot and the invasive did, that was advantageous. If the natives did have a taproot and the invasive didn't, then that was advantageous. And this may provide further insight and show trends for which invasives will tolerate climate change best. As for which software I plan on using, I'm pretty torn between ArcGIS Pro and QGIS. I'm most familiar and comfortable with Pro, and most government agencies do have some access to, if not Pro, then other Esri products. It's very expensive though. If I want to make it as low cost as possible with a view that other organizations could duplicate my analysis, I should use QGIS. I do have some, but really very little experience with QGIS, but I am worried about the limited functions available compared to Pro. I will probably try QGIS first and see how far I can get, and then switch if necessary. I will also explore what other low cost or free options might be available that haven't been presented in our classes, since they seem to be focused on Esri products, which is understandable considering their prevalence and versatility, which is another reason I'm considering just using Pro. From this analysis, I expect to find that some species will not survive in the more extreme climate change scenarios, and others will thrive under the new conditions. I also expect to see some general trends in which plants do well, either because they have a taproot or because of their photosynthesis pathway. This knowledge will increase the clarity about which species should be targeted for removal. Criteria for consideration can also be expanded if time allows to account for other variables. Different habitat types have different nutrient availability, which is really important. And some species require a dormancy period, and that may or may not still exist under the new climate change conditions. As with any project, one must be aware of any biases in data or problems with your design. The iNaturalist location data is like way biased towards areas where there are people, those people have cell phones, and those people with cell phones have an interest in plants. This is not an issue for my study area, since the NER is well traveled and the staff there also collect data, but this would be an issue for remote areas. It is also possible that the climate models are not accurate. I will be using the most up-to-date models I can find and using 3 levels of prediction, low, moderate, and high change to increase the likelihood that the true conditions will be covered by my analysis. The most uncertainty comes from the plant data. Some species have not been studied extensively, so tolerances may be an estimate based on similar species. There may also be interactions between environmental criteria that have unforeseen consequences. So this is a picture of Myconia, extremely large plants. The leaves are larger than the typical adult's torso. They're just like, and not only do they shade out their competition, but the size and shape of their with a higher velocity, which increases erosion and washes away native seeds. Their root systems are also really shallow. So when I say they increase erosion, I mean like the entire sides of mountains are falling off because there's just no deep roots to hold that soil there. This would be really hard to predict without having studied the plant extensively in its native and in its invaded environments. For the plants, I will also use the most up-to-date information and my best judgment to determine validity. And I will be using individual studies to fill in any data gaps that I find from the CalIPAC or the Plant Atlas data. I plan to use the spring and summer to do the bulk of my data collection, and this will ensure that most species are in the growing or flowering phase and are therefore easier to identify. And this will be helpful when I verify species locations, which I do plan on doing some of just to verify that my starting data is accurate. And then I anticipate this will take no longer than 2 months. I will then move on to the database design and data entry. And I will also use this time to research any gaps in species information that I have in the data. After my database is ready, I can begin to create my high temperature and drought duration climate zones and calculate the change in area for each species. I plan to take 596B in fall 2 if possible, and use that time to analyze my findings and prepare for my presentation to be ready to present by the beginning of December. Ideally, I would love to present my findings at the Tijuana River NER, and I am in contact with some of the staff there. So hopefully I will be able to swing that. I think that would be really amazing. But I would also be interested in presenting online at the virtual conference if that happens again here at Penn State. And here I have listed my resources and references and my photo credits. It's probably half and half biology studies and GIS studies. And then here are my photo credits. And I would love to answer any questions that you guys have. I can figure out how to see the chat.
Should be a link down to move your cursor down the bottom of the Zoom window. There should be a chat option.
Yeah, I found it. Thank you.
Okay. Well, great job, Cheryl. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
While we're waiting for folks to ask questions, I'll kick things off here. You mentioned earlier, I believe, about policy towards invasive species. Do you know if the policy, if there's a policy that's set at the national level or at the state level, or is policy highly variant upon the park or the resource that's being focused on?
Yeah, it's definitely highly varied. I know that there's, what I wish there was policy on is people not being able to bring in or plant invasives, because you can still go, like, for example, asparagus fern is like, not only is it highly invasive, it's incredibly difficult to remove. And yet you can find it at every Lowe's, every Home Depot. People just plant in their yards, like, you know, they don't have any idea. But in my opinion, it should be regulated that Lowe's and Home Depot just shouldn't be able to sell asparagus fern. But then when you're looking at individual parks or community spaces, it's really on a park by park basis. In general, parks are really underfunded and understaffed, and priority is definitely given to the cultural resources of the park, and invasive control or any ecological work at all really gets the backseat for that.
So Yeah, I had no idea with the Lowe's and Home Depot and things like that. So there really needs to be more of a grassroots effort at establishing, I don't know whether a law, I don't know whether that's the right word or not here. But to limit what kinds of vegetation are sold by, I guess, not only these big box stores, but I'm sure you can get those plants at other locations too.
Yeah, absolutely. You can, if you do a little digging, both in where I lived in Jacksonville and here in San Diego, you can find local nurseries that only sell native plants. But it does take a little bit of research, and a lot of people don't even realize that that's a consideration that they should have. So they're definitely a grassroots sort of education and policy effort would just really be helpful.
Yeah, I agree with that. That's very insightful. Never would have thought about that. Does anyone have any questions for Cheryl?
So Dan asks if I plan to share my research with the park officials from the park. Yes, absolutely. I love the Tijuana River NER. It's one of my favorite places in San Diego. I go there all the time. I'm always bugging the staff, hoping that they'll just spontaneously give me a job. And I plan to work with them. They do active research there. It's a research facility as well as a park. And so I'm definitely going to try to rope them into helping me with data collection and data verification. And also, I would like to present there. And even if I can't, I will definitely share my results with them.
Cheryl, why don't you go ahead and put your contact info in the chat so that if someone has a follow-up question, they can get a hold of you.
Okay, there is my email.
All right, great. All right, well, thank you very much for your presentation. And last up, we have Kevin Blair. Kevin, if you want to start sharing your screen.
All right, good morning or good afternoon. Let me get my screen pulled up here.
There we go.
All right, does that look good?
Yes, you're good to go.
Thank you. All right, my name is Kevin Blair, and this is my peer review presentation for Geography 596A. And my advisor is Dr. Marcela Suarez. Currently, I work as a program analyst for a small agency within the Department of the Interior. And while this project is not really directed towards a challenge based on my current position, I think it will be a way for me to offer me a way to pivot to some opportunities to use GIS in support of some of my long-term goals. And I would like to share with you my research proposal. The title for my project is Spatiotemporal Analysis of School Shootings in the United States. Here's an overview of the presentation and the topics I'll discuss. I'll begin with an introduction, move on to some research questions, share with you a summary of the literature review that I've done, the proposed methodology I plan to use, share with you a few quick data and map shots. I'll discuss the methods I plan to use, the technology that I'll take advantage of, my proposed timeline, give you some acknowledgements and sources that I've used, and an opportunity for questions. School shootings have taken place hundreds of times over the past 2 decades. Lives have been lost, families destroyed, and communities changed forever. From some of the most well-known shootings, such as Columbine High School or Sandy Hook Elementary, to a December 2021 TikTok challenge known as Shoot Up Your School Day. From the time period 2013 to 2020, over 800 shootings have taken place on school campuses. Just a few days ago, on March 9th, a student was shot and injured when a weapon discharged on a school basketball team bus in San Antonio, Texas. These acts of violence have taken place across the country and resulted in hundreds being killed and even more being wounded. Much research has been done on the topic of school shootings from both a demographics and psychology perspective. There's many nonprofit organizations working in this space to study the issue. And many more studies have been done to understand violent crime generally. Some have examined the individuals who perpetrated these attacks, but less has been written about the spatial and temporal components of this topic. In this emotionally charged aftermath of school shootings, politicians, activists, news media, and ordinary citizens often cite statistics that can present a distorted view of how many of these incidents occur. These statistics are often used to fuel ongoing debates about gun control, arming teachers, and school security. As of the 20th anniversary on the attack of Columbine was approaching, students and teachers across Colorado awoke in April 2019 to news that an armed 18-year-old woman with an infatuation with the massacre had flown across the country to Colorado, and that hundreds of schools had been, as a precaution, locked down as authorities frantically searched for her. By the end of the day, the woman, a Florida high school student, was discovered dead of an apparent self-inflicted gunshot wound in the mountains west of Denver. In the last bullet point, there I mentioned that there's a challenge in working with this data that I want to address. In the interest of clarity, the sources track every time a firearm discharges a live round inside or into a school building or on or onto a school campus or grounds, as documented by the press. Incidents where guns were brought into schools but not discharged are not included. The numbers reflect incidents that resulted in a death or an injury, as well as those in which no one was injured. One area that I hope to spend time and refine my parameters on what constitutes a school shooting. Any firearm discharge on school grounds, only involving students, negligent discharges by the securities or police officers. In developing my research questions, I plan to focus my efforts on explaining the when, where, and why of school shootings. I'll do this by dividing my project into three main sections. When are school shootings more likely to happen on a specific day of the week, time of the year? How has the pattern of school shootings changed over time from year to year? As I move towards the where, are school shootings more likely to happen in large cities or small? Is there a geographic tendency of school shootings? Are school shootings located in rural or urban areas? And the why. What demographic variables may increase likelihoods of school shootings? Does the criminology of other violent crime match the demographics of school shootings? I've organized my literature review in the same fashion as my research questions. For temporal analysis, a research paper that I will use in conducting my own project is the non-parametric spatiotemporal analysis of violent crime, a case study in Rio de Janeiro metropolitan area by Fuentes Santos, Gonzalez, Montiga, and Zubueli. In this paper, the data is gathered to describe gunfire patterns in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. I find the methodology of the research extremely interesting because their use of data and analysis to help shape predictive analysis, as well as resource allocations. It also reminds me of several lessons I've learned throughout my time at Penn State. One such one is the modifiable aerial unit problem that will be consideration I'll take into consideration. One critical area in which I was sure to reference back to this report is how the displays the results, the uses of charts and histograms to effectively show the temporal nature of the results. For the spatial distribution, the spatial and social patternings of property crime in Toronto neighborhoods, a spatial quantitative approach. This literature shows that the occurrence of crime is frequently concentrated in particular neighborhoods and is related to a variety of socioeconomic and crime opportunity factors. This study explores the broad patterning of property and violent crime among different socioeconomic stratums and across space by examining the neighborhood's socioeconomic conditions and individual characteristics of the offenders associated with the crime in the city of Toronto. This research will shape my use of spatial cluster analysis. And for the spatial analysis, statistical analysis of spatial data, the geography of crime has been researched in criminology from the start of the discipline. The development and use of statistical methods specifically designed for spatially referenced data has been evolving. This report discusses the relevance of spatial analysis, the nature of spatial data, and the issues of sampling and choosing a spatial unit of analysis. This report further discusses the analysis of spatial distributions such as spatial structure, address spatial autocorrelation, and it reviews a variety of spatially informed regression models and their applications. This influenced my choice to use geographically weighted regression. And last, risk factors in school shootings. Another piece of literature that stood out to me while conducting my review was this piece. This report discusses 9 instances of school shootings and the risk factors associated with those events. This is relevant to my studies because I'll be using demographics data to look for correlation in risk factors and instances of school shootings. It is relevant to my research because the report notes that the traditional risk factors for violence are different in the case of school shootings versus other violent crime. The demographics are different for both the assailant and the location. On this slide, I just wanted to share some preliminary charting that I had done with raw data to model the layout for the final project. As you can see, the top 10 states are included with the number of shootings in each of those states over the 2013 to 2020 time period. I plan to normalize the number of shootings with the population data to better represent the statistics for each state. That's the census kind of logo there. And as you notice that there's larger population states are mostly represented on this list, Texas and California, clearly larger populations. Could be relevant information to that. Here's data that's modeled in a map to get an idea of the distribution of the points. These are just for a quick look at the data prior to conducting the analysis. The map on the left is the entire United States, and the right is zoomed into a smaller area on the East Coast, so it can be viewed a little bit easier. Here's a flow chart discussing my plan for moving through my research. At the top is developing my research questions. This includes picking a topic and understanding the issues related to it. Then, of course, it was time to look for data and to support my research and identify the variables to test. As previously discussed, cleaning the data and deciding on parameters will follow. Then I'll move to the 3 ways where I'll conduct my research: the when, where, and the why, temporal analysis, spatial distribution, and spatial analysis, and the accompanying methods that I plan to use in the visuals I'll include. Geographic weighted regression evaluates a local model of the variable or processes you're trying to understand or predict by fitting a regression equation to each feature in the data set. GWR constructs these separate equations by incorporating the dependent and explanatory variables of the feature falling within the neighborhood of each target feature. Specifically, the analysis will use geographic weighted regression to model the relationship between the demographic factors such as race, income level, population density. GWR has been used in criminology research and previous studies of violence. These studies provide support for the framework and rationale behind this paper. Also, local Moran's I is a local spatial autocorrelation statistic that identifies local clusters or local outliers. A positive value for an I indicates that a feature has a neighboring feature with a similar high or low attribute value, and the feature is part of a cluster. A negative value indicates that this feature has neighboring features with similar values, and this feature could be an outlier. plan to conduct my analysis using ArcGIS Pro for spatial distribution and analysis in the forms of maps and charts and tables, and Excel for charting and histograms of the temporal portion of the data. I've included an approximate timeline for my research and planning, working around upcoming courses. I'll continue to work on this project in between now and my final semester planned in the fall. I'm planning one class for the summer semester, Geography 486, to brush up on my cartographic skills, and retaking 596B, hopefully in the fall one semester. Here I've provided some of the sources I've used in this document. I'd just like to use the opportunity to discuss some future directions that I could take this project down the line. The study could go on to explore topics through a variety of different research methods. One idea is to explore any key events that could have shaped follow-on events. For example, the shootings increase or decrease after such events as Columbine or Sandy Hook. How has COVID changed the number of shootings with so many students being in remote school settings? As I've almost reached the end of my project, I wanted to share with you what drew me to this topic. I have two sons that were involved at the site of a school shooting. This took place on May 7th, 2019 at the STEM school in Highlands Ranch. It's a charter school in the suburbs of Denver. One student was killed and 8 others were injured. My son, who was in the cafeteria at the time, saw a fellow student run by screaming that there was someone shooting in the halls. He fled with a group of students to a nearby shopping center and called me to pick him up. Luckily, I was working from home at the time. I raced across town to pick him up. When we traveled to the school to see if we could get his brother was forced to shelter in the classroom while law enforcement from around the area swarmed the school looking for the shooters. They were fortunate to leave the school physically unharmed, but memories of that day will be with them forever, I'm sure. Cannot change that the events took place, but I thought that it's an area of research that I will be able to have a personal connection with, and maybe help better understand the when, where, and why that these things take place from a unique angle. Before I open the floor for questions, I'd like to thank everyone for their time. I'd like to thank my peers along the way who offered me insightful comments, and the professors who took the time to offer constructive feedback on my work, especially Dr. Suarez for being incredibly generous with her time and attention. She has recommended so many wonderful sources to help me with my research and format my project. It's been an absolute pleasure working with her, and I'd like to open up for questions.
All right, Kevin, thanks for your presentation. Looks like you have a question already in the chat window.
Looks like the first question, it says, are you going to look at the gun policies of the region? You're going to look at the gun policies of the region at the time of the incident and if they have changed since? That's an excellent question. And I had thought about including as one of the variables or several variables to test is the gun policies of each. Probably at the state level would be the easiest way to go about doing that. And whether that variable has an impact on the number of shootings that took place in that state. There's probably several ways to look at it. States like California and New York have typically considered the strictest gun laws. So I guess I could look at something like background checks or like waiting periods and include those with each state and maybe build that into a database and say whether those test whether those have an impact. It's an excellent idea. Thank you. And I saw you were planning on using the spatial clustering hotspots more in Xi analysis. Have you also thought about using the emerging hotspots analysis to analyze the temporal aspects along with the spatial? To be honest with you, I hadn't looked at that idea, and I definitely will do some more research and get back to you. It's something I'll have to familiarize myself with and see, and that may be an excellent way to present the temporal aspect. Thank you for that comment. And the link. In the aftermath of one of the tragedies, we frequently hear discussions of how coverage may inspire copycat events. You mentioned that this may be a future topic to investigate. Has there been any research on how these events may cluster temporally? I haven't come across any. I know that there certainly is some research on the topic, like you said, of copycat events. And like I mentioned, the one girl that traveled across the country on the 20th anniversary of Columbine to travel to Colorado, and that, you know, they locked all the schools down here. But I haven't seen any research specifically on how they cluster temporally. But it's definitely an idea that I could probably further expand upon. Thank you for that. One of the strategies for dealing with this problem is instituting a ban on assault weapons. The US had such a ban from 1994 to 2004. It looked like you were starting with 2013, but it would be interesting to see if you could go back further to see if there were any changes in the pattern in the ban timeframe. That's definitely an excellent idea. Some of the data sources I came across just started at 2013, and so I used that as kind of my sample size. It would be interesting. You could also kind of tie that assault weapons ban. I believe California's kind of had their own on the books, and so while the federal assault weapons ban sunsetted, the California still has one on the books, and whether I wonder if I could look at I guess how that changed, or use that as some kind of control looking forward, or if perhaps other sources have a longer time period of data available. That would be an excellent way to look at this problem. Thank you so much for all your questions and comments. If there's any more. Where are you getting your data? Excellent. Let me pull that up. If you take a look here, this gunfire on school grounds in the United States, Everytown Research and Policy, and that was retrieved on February 24th, and I've included a link here, everytownresearch.org. They have a very nice interface that you can actually choose the years, and you can break it down by state. You can and download those to an Excel file. It's really nice, and then plot those in your GIS. Thank you.
All right, Kevin, if you want to put your contact info into the chat window.
Perfect.
And then I had previously pasted the link for the peer evaluation for presenters. So if you would take a few moments and give feedback to that extent, we would appreciate that. Then otherwise, I want to thank everyone for taking time out of their day to attend our presentation today. We have another presentation coming up Monday evening for 596A, so make sure to attend that if you can. Otherwise, I hope everyone has an enjoyable day, and we'll see you all later.